Ruthless Millionaire Marries a Broke Nanny. What she does on their wedding night is shocking. The wedding hall was a display of opulence only a billionaire could afford. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, reflecting off gold-trimmed walls and polished marble floors. Guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos sipped champagne from crystal flutes, their laughter blending with the soft hum of an orchestra. In the center of it all stood Victor Langston, the groom, commanding attention as always. Tall, with chiseled features and piercing gray eyes, he exuded confidence, power, and an aura of invincibility. He was the kind of man who could bend the world to his will, and he knew it. But tonight wasn't just any night for Victor. This was his wedding, though not one born out of love or even convenience. It was a spectacle, a performance staged for an audience of business associates and high society elites. His bride, Lily Morgan, a nanny with no pedigree or wealth to her name, was a shocking choice even by Victor's standards. And that, perhaps, was the point. The whispers began the moment Lily walked into the hall. Her dress, though beautiful, was far simpler than the gowns worn by the other women in attendance. Her hair, swept into an elegant bun, revealed a face unadorned by heavy makeup. There was a quiet grace about her, a sharp contrast to the extravagance around her. She felt their eyes on her, the judgment, the disbelief, but she held her head high. Quite the choice, Victor, a voice murmured behind him as he adjusted his cufflinks. It was Charles Davenport, a longtime rival and occasional ally. He smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. Didn't think you'd ever marry someone without a six-figure trust fund. Victor didn't flinch. He thrived on criticism, especially from men like Charles. Turning slightly, he gave a thin smile. Why settle for predictable when you can have a challenge? Charles chuckled, lifting his glass in mock salute. A challenge, indeed. Victor's eyes shifted to Lily, who was now exchanging polite smiles with a woman who'd clearly only spoken to her out of obligation. He had chosen her for a reason, though not one he cared to admit even to himself. It had started as a bet, an offhand challenge from a group of business associates over cigars and whiskey. Marry someone completely out of his social circle, they'd said. Someone who didn't belong. Victor, always eager to prove himself, had agreed. It was, to him, just another transaction, a game to win. Lily, however, was not playing. Their first meeting had been purely coincidental. Victor rarely involved himself in the minutiae of his household staff, but a scheduling error had brought him home early one afternoon. He'd found her in the garden, kneeling on the ground with his young niece, Sophie, who was covered in mud but laughing uncontrollably. Lily had looked up, startled, and for a brief moment Victor had been caught off guard. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a determination that intrigued him. He'd dismissed the feeling immediately, of course. She was the nanny and he was Victor Langston, a man who didn't waste time on people like her. But as the days passed, he found himself watching her more closely. She was different, not just in her simplicity, but in the way she carried herself. She didn't defer to him the way others did. She was polite, yes, but never subservient. It was maddening and fascinating all at once. When he finally approached her with his proposition, she'd stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You want me to marry you?" she'd asked, her voice calm but tinged with disbelief. "Yes," he'd replied, leaning back in his chair. "It's a business arrangement. 6 months. You'll have access to anything you need, and in return, you'll play the part of my wife." Lily had folded her hands in her lap, her gaze unwavering. "And why would I agree to that?" Victor had smiled, confident as always. "Because it's an opportunity you'll never have again. Financial security, access to resources you can't even imagine. Think of what you could do with that." For a moment, she'd said nothing. Then, to his surprise, she'd nodded. "All right, but I have my conditions." He hadn't expected her to negotiate, but she had, and he'd agreed. It didn't matter what she wanted. He knew he'd win in the end. He always did. Now, as the ceremony began and Lily walked down the aisle, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Really watched. Not just by the guests, but by Lily herself. Her gaze was steady, almost unreadable, as if she knew something he didn't. It was unsettling. The vows were exchanged, and though they were carefully worded to sound sincere, neither of them truly believed in what they were saying. It was all for show. The applause that followed was loud and enthusiastic, but Victor barely heard it. His focus was on Lily, who stood beside him with an expression that was impossible to decipher. Later, during the reception, Victor was the perfect host. He made rounds, shook hands, and charmed his guests. Lily, meanwhile, played her role flawlessly. She was poised, gracious, and just mysterious enough to intrigue the people around her. But when their eyes met across the room, there was a tension that neither of them could ignore. As the evening wore on, Victor found himself watching her more closely. There was something about the way she moved, the way she interacted with the guests, that made him uneasy. She wasn't nervous or overwhelmed. She was calculating, as if she were taking everything in and filing it away for later use. By the time they left for the mansion, Victor's curiosity had turned into something else. Something darker, more urgent. He didn't trust her, and that was a problem. When they arrived, the house was quiet, the staff having been given the night off. Victor led Lily to the master suite, his steps brisk and deliberate. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "After you." Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside. The room was as opulent as the rest of the house, with high ceilings, a king-sized bed draped in silk, and a view of the city skyline that was breathtaking even at night. She walked to the center of the room, her posture straight, her expression calm. Victor closed the door behind him, leaning against it as he watched her. "Well," he said, his voice low, "you've made it through the first act. What's next?" Lily turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, she said nothing, and the silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then finally she spoke. "What's next, Mr. Langston, is that you're going to listen to me for once." Her tone was firm, almost commanding, and for the first time in years, Victor felt a flicker of doubt. Victor straightened slightly, his expression sharpening as Lily's words settled in the air between them. It was rare for anyone to speak to him that way, let alone someone he had deemed a mere pawn in his plans. His lips twitched in what might have been amusement or irritation. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice low and edged with steel. Lily didn't flinch. Her composure remained intact, her gaze steady. "You heard me. This agreement, this performance, whatever you want to call it. It may be your game, but I'm not here to be a silent spectator." Victor pushed off the door, his movements deliberate as he closed the distance between them. He towered over her, his presence a mixture of intimidation and intrigue. "And what exactly do you expect me to do, Lily? Hand over control? Let you dictate the terms now that the ink is dry?" "I expect you to understand that this isn't about control," she said evenly. "This is about respect. You may think you've bought me, but I didn't agree to this for your amusement." His eyes narrowed. "Then why did you agree? Let's not pretend you're above ambition. Everyone has their price, and I met yours." Lily folded her arms, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to his simmering frustration. "You can believe whatever you want, Victor. It doesn't change the fact that you need me as much as I need you." Victor's laugh was cold, humorless. "Need you? You flatter yourself." "Do I?" she asked, her tone unshaken. "You're the one who orchestrated this arrangement. I've seen your world, Victor. It's built on power plays and appearances. You brought me into this because you needed something no one else could give you. Authenticity." Her words struck a nerve, though Victor wouldn't admit it. Authenticity, the very thing he had carefully stripped from his life in exchange for power and control. He masked his discomfort with a sneer. "You're a quick study, I'll give you that. But don't mistake insight for leverage." "I don't need leverage," Lily said. "I need you to keep your end of the deal." Victor's jaw tightened. He hated the way she stood there, so unyielding, so unafraid of him. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was supposed to be grateful, compliant, eager to please. Instead, she was a challenge, a complication he hadn't anticipated. "What exactly do you think I've done to violate our arrangement?" he asked, his tone dangerously calm. "You've already decided this marriage is just another game to win," Lily said. "But it's not. Not for me. I won't let you use me as a prop for your ego." Victor stared at her, his mind racing. She was right, of course, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of admitting it. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You agreed to this, Lily. Whatever motives you're hiding behind that calm exterior, you signed up for this. Don't try to rewrite the rules now." "I'm not rewriting anything," she said, her voice firm. "I'm just reminding you that I'm not here to be trampled on." Victor's lips curled into a cold smile. "Then you'd better hope you can keep up, Mrs. Langston." Lily held his gaze for a long moment before turning away. "I don't need to keep up, Victor. I need to stay true to myself. That's the only way I'll win." The word win hung in the air, a subtle challenge that prickled at Victor's pride. She was playing a game, all right, but it wasn't the one he thought he'd set the rules for. The realization both frustrated and intrigued him. He watched as she walked toward the window, her silhouette framed by the city lights. For the first time, he wondered if he'd underestimated her. Lily Morgan was no ordinary woman, and this was no ordinary marriage. Whatever she had planned, he would find out, and when he did, he would make sure the outcome was still his to control. Victor leaned against the edge of the bed, crossing his arms as he studied her. "You're an enigma, Lily, but don't mistake my curiosity for weakness. I don't lose." Lily turned her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "There's a first time for everything, Mr. Langston." Her words left Victor speechless. Not because he believed her, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure what would happen next. The tension lingered as Lily moved toward the adjoining room, closing the door behind her without another word. Victor remained where he was, the silence of the suite pressing down on him. For a man who thrived on control, the uncertainty of his new wife's motives was unsettling. And yet, he couldn't deny that she fascinated him. That fascination, he realized, might be his undoing. Victor spent the rest of the night in the master suite, pacing the room like a lion in a cage. For a man who lived his life making calculated decisions and always having the upper hand, Lily's quiet defiance was a curveball he hadn't prepared for. The way she looked at him, so calm and composed, as though she were holding cards he couldn't see, it made his skin prickle with irritation and something else, something he didn't care to name. He poured himself a drink from the decanter on the bedside table, the sharp burn of whiskey doing little to settle his unease. This was supposed to be simple, a transactional marriage to satisfy his bet and prove, once again, that he could control any situation. But Lily had changed the game, and Victor hated losing. The morning came too soon. The early sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the opulent room. Victor woke to find the other side of the bed untouched, the crisp sheets a reminder that Lily had chosen to sleep elsewhere. He told himself it didn't matter. It wasn't like this was a real marriage, but a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind suggested otherwise. He found her in the garden, sitting on a wrought iron bench with a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair loose and catching the soft morning breeze. She looked at peace, completely unbothered by the previous night's tension. "You're up early," Victor said, stepping onto the stone path that led to her. She glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the garden. Old habits. Victor studied her for a moment, his mind already working to decipher her. "I assume you've had time to think about our conversation last night." "I have," she said simply, taking a sip of her tea. "And?" He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. Lily set her cup down on the small table beside her and finally met his gaze. "And I meant what I said. I won't let you use me to stroke your ego, Victor. If this is going to work, there have to be boundaries." Victor's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to people drawing lines he couldn't cross. "You're in no position to set terms, Lily. Let me remind you who controls this arrangement. And let me remind you that control isn't everything," she said, her tone measured but firm. "You may have the money, the power, and the resources, but that doesn't mean you can dictate who I am or how I choose to live my life." Victor's lips thinned into a tight line. "You're remarkably bold for someone who agreed to marry me out of necessity." "I agreed because I saw an opportunity," she corrected him. "But don't confuse opportunity with submission. I'm not one of your acquisitions, Victor." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He was used to winning arguments through sheer force of will, but Lily wasn't backing down. She was standing her ground, and he found himself simultaneously infuriated and impressed. "Fine," he said at last, his voice cold. "Have it your way. But don't think for a second that you can outmaneuver me. You're in my world now, Lily, and I always come out on top." Lily's smile was faint but undeniable. "We'll see." The days that followed were a delicate dance of power and perception. Victor introduced Lily to his social circle, parading her as his new wife at charity galas, exclusive dinners, and high-powered business meetings. To his associates, she was a curiosity, a puzzle they couldn't quite figure out. She didn't fit the mold of the typical billionaire's wife, and yet, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that left them intrigued. Victor watched her closely during these events, waiting for her to falter, to reveal some flaw he could exploit. But Lily remained composed, her smile never wavering even under the sharp gaze of his most critical acquaintances. If she was nervous, she hid it well. At one particularly lavish dinner party, Victor's longtime associate, Eleanor Bishop, cornered him in the library. Eleanor was a sharp woman, her piercing blue eyes as unforgiving as her business tactics. "She's an interesting choice," Eleanor said, her tone laced with curiosity. "Not your usual type." Victor took a sip of his scotch, leaning casually against the fireplace. "I'm not one to be predictable." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Predictable? No. Calculated? Always. So tell me, what's your angle?" Victor smirked. "Maybe I wanted a change." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Be careful, Victor. Change is a double-edged sword. It can cut you as easily as it can cut others." He didn't respond, but her words lingered long after she left. Back at the mansion, Lily sat in the study, a stack of books spread out in front of her. Victor found her there, her brow furrowed as she scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal. "You're awfully studious for someone who doesn't need to work anymore," he said, stepping into the room. Lily glanced up, her expression neutral. "Some of us find value in knowledge, even when it's not required." Victor walked over, leaning against the desk. "And what, exactly, are you working on?" She hesitated for a moment before closing the journal. "Just plans." "Plans for what?" "For my future," she said simply. "For when this arrangement is over." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You're awfully confident it will end on your terms." "Confidence is key," Lily replied, standing and gathering her books. "Something you of all people should understand." Victor watched her leave, a strange unease settling over him. He didn't like the feeling that she was always one step ahead, that she was playing a game he didn't fully understand. And yet, he couldn't deny that she fascinated him more with each passing day. Victor sat in his office that night, the lights of the city glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim light. His mind was restless, a mix of frustration and curiosity swirling as he thought about Lily. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever encountered. Most people in his world wanted something from him: power, money, influence. But Lily seemed untouched by any of it. She wasn't impressed, wasn't intimidated. And it unnerved him. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. A text from Charles Davenport. "Charles, how's married life treating you? Ready to admit defeat yet?" Victor scowled and set the phone aside. He had no intention of admitting anything to anyone, especially not Charles, who would love nothing more than to see Victor stumble. The bet wasn't just about proving he could win. It was about maintaining the control and dominance he'd built his empire on. But the problem wasn't the bet. The problem was that Lily wasn't playing by the rules he'd expected her to, and Victor didn't like surprises. The next morning, Victor found Lily in the kitchen, a place he rarely ventured. She was seated at the counter, sipping coffee and flipping through a magazine. Her relaxed demeanor stood in stark contrast to his usual sharp-edged mornings of meetings and deadlines. "You're unusually cheerful," he remarked, stepping into the room. She glanced up, her expression calm. "It's a beautiful day." He poured himself a cup of coffee, watching her from the corner of his eye. "You seem to be adjusting well." "To what?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your world." "Our arrangement," he clarified. Lily smiled faintly. "I've had to adapt to a lot of things in my life. This is no different." Victor leaned against the counter, studying her. "You make it sound like you're just going through the motions." "And if I am?" she countered. "Does it bother you?" He paused, caught off guard by her directness. "It doesn't." Her smile widened slightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. Because I'm not here to please you, Victor." The words were a slap, but she delivered them so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that Victor didn't have a retort. He watched as she slid off the stool and left the kitchen, her coffee cup still half full. For the first time in a long time, Victor felt at a loss. Over the next few weeks, their lives fell into an uneasy rhythm. Victor continued to host events, attend meetings, and maintain the facade of a perfect marriage. Lily played her role flawlessly in public, charming his associates and deflecting intrusive questions with grace. But in private, she was distant, enigmatic, and entirely uninterested in engaging with him beyond the bare minimum. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Victor returned home to find Lily sitting in the library. She was curled up in an armchair, a blanket draped over her lap and a book in her hands. The scene was so ordinary, so domestic, that it caught him off guard. "You've made yourself comfortable," he said, his tone cooler than he intended. Lily looked up, her expression neutral. "Should I not?" He shrugged, stepping closer. "Most people in your position would be trying to impress me." "I'm not most people," she said simply, closing the book. "And I'm not interested in impressing you." Victor let out a dry laugh. "So you've made clear. But let me ask you something. If you're not here to impress me, what are you here for?" She met his gaze, her eyes steady and unflinching. "I'm here because I made a deal, and I intend to keep my end of it." Her words were logical, detached, but there was something beneath them, something Victor couldn't quite place. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "And what happens when the deal is over?" Lily didn't hesitate. "I move on." The simplicity of her answer shouldn't have bothered him, but it did. Victor straightened, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You talk as if this is just a job. Do you ever consider what's at stake here?" "Of course," she said, her tone calm. "I consider it every day. But you and I both know this isn't about stakes, Victor. It's about control. And you hate that you don't have it." Her words hit their mark, and for a moment Victor felt exposed. He masked it with a smirk, shaking his head. "You think you've figured me out? I think you're used to people being afraid of you," Lily said, standing and gathering her book. "But I'm not, and that scares you." Victor watched her leave the room, her words echoing in his mind. She was wrong, of course. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of anyone. But as the door closed behind her, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she might be right. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between them only grew. Victor found himself drawn to Lily, not just because she challenged him, but because she refused to be predictable. She didn't seek his approval or bend to his will, and it both infuriated and fascinated him. One night, after an exhausting gala, Victor confronted her in their suite. She was removing her earrings, her expression serene despite the evening's chaos. "You're good at this," he said, his tone sharp. "Playing the perfect wife." Lily glanced at him in the mirror. "I thought that's what you wanted." "What I want," Victor said, stepping closer, "is to know what you're really after." She turned to face him, her eyes steady. "You think I have an agenda? Don't you?" he challenged. Lily tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "If I do, you'll find out eventually." Victor's frustration boiled over. "You're infuriating, you know that? "So I've been told," she said lightly, turning back to the mirror. Victor stared at her reflection, his mind racing. He'd built his life on power, control, and calculated moves. But Lily was an enigma, a puzzle he couldn't solve. And for the first time, he wondered if he was in over his head. Victor spent the rest of the night in the master suite, pacing the room like a lion in a cage. For a man who lived his life making calculated decisions and always having the upper hand, Lily's quiet defiance was a curveball he hadn't prepared for. The way she looked at him, so calm and composed, as though she were holding cards he couldn't see, it made his skin prickle with irritation and something else, something he didn't care to name. He poured himself a drink from the decanter on the bedside table, the sharp burn of whiskey doing little to settle his unease. This was supposed to be simple, a transactional marriage to satisfy his bet and prove, once again, that he could control any situation. But Lily had changed the game, and Victor hated losing. The next morning, Victor found Lily in the garden, sitting on a wrought iron bench with a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair loose and catching the soft morning breeze. She looked at peace, completely unbothered by the previous night's tension. "You're up early," Victor said, stepping onto the stone path that led to her. She glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the garden. Old habits. Victor studied her for a moment, his mind already working to decipher her. "I assume you've had time to think about our conversation last night." "I have," she said simply, taking a sip of her tea. "And?" He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. Lily set her cup down on the small table beside her and finally met his gaze. "And I meant what I said. I won't let you use me to stroke your ego, Victor. If this is going to work, there have to be boundaries." Victor's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to people drawing lines he couldn't cross. "You're in no position to set terms, Lily. Let me remind you who controls this arrangement. And let me remind you that control isn't everything," she said, her tone measured but firm. "You may have the money, the power, and the resources, but that doesn't mean you can dictate who I am or how I choose to live my life." Victor's lips thinned into a tight line. "You're remarkably bold for someone who agreed to marry me out of necessity." "I agreed because I saw an opportunity," she corrected him. "But don't confuse opportunity with submission. I'm not one of your acquisitions, Victor." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. He was used to winning arguments through sheer force of will, but Lily wasn't backing down. She was standing her ground, and he found himself simultaneously infuriated and impressed. "Fine," he said at last, his voice cold. "Have it your way. But don't think for a second that you can outmaneuver me. You're in my world now, Lily, and I always come out on top." Lily's smile was faint but undeniable. "We'll see." The days that followed were a delicate dance of power and perception. Victor introduced Lily to his social circle, parading her as his new wife at charity galas, exclusive dinners, and high-powered business meetings. To his associates, she was a curiosity, a puzzle they couldn't quite figure out. She didn't fit the mold of the typical billionaire's wife, and yet, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that left them intrigued. Victor watched her closely during these events, waiting for her to falter, to reveal some flaw he could exploit. But Lily remained composed, her smile never wavering even under the sharp gaze of his most critical acquaintances. If she was nervous, she hid it well. At one particularly lavish dinner party, Victor's longtime associate, Eleanor Bishop, cornered him in the library. Eleanor was a sharp woman, her piercing blue eyes as unforgiving as her business tactics. "She's an interesting choice," Eleanor said, her tone laced with curiosity. "Not your usual type." Victor took a sip of his scotch, leaning casually against the fireplace. "I'm not one to be predictable." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Predictable? No. Calculated? Always. So tell me, what's your angle?" Victor smirked. "Maybe I wanted a change." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Be careful, Victor. Change is a double-edged sword. It can cut you as easily as it can cut others." He didn't respond, but her words lingered long after she left. Back at the mansion, Lily sat in the study, a stack of books spread out in front of her. Victor found her there, her brow furrowed as she scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal. "You're awfully studious for someone who doesn't need to work anymore," he said, stepping into the room. Lily glanced up, her expression neutral. "Some of us find value in knowledge, even when it's not required." Victor walked over, leaning against the desk. "And what exactly are you working on?" She hesitated for a moment before closing the journal. "Just plans." "Plans for what?" "For my future," she said simply. "For when this arrangement is over." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You're awfully confident it will end on your terms." "Confidence is key," Lily replied, standing and gathering her books. "Something you of all people should understand." Victor watched her leave, a strange unease settling over him. He didn't like the feeling that she was always one step ahead, that she was playing a game he didn't fully understand. And yet, he couldn't deny that she fascinated him more with each passing day. Victor remained standing in the study long after Lily had left, her words replaying in his mind. The sheer audacity of her confidence was something he couldn't quite fathom. People in his world didn't talk like that. They didn't challenge him, didn't stand their ground when he pushed. Yet Lily seemed unshakable, always a step ahead, always prepared to meet his authority with her quiet defiance. The days turned into a tense rhythm. Every interaction between them was laced with an undercurrent of unspoken challenges. Victor continued to host dinners and meetings, showcasing his wife as if she were another piece in his arsenal of wealth and influence. To the outside world, they seemed like a perfect match, her quiet elegance balancing his commanding presence. But behind closed doors, their conversations were anything but harmonious. It was during one such dinner party that Lily once again caught Victor off guard. The evening had been a success by his standards, an extravagant affair filled with the city's elite. Lily had spent most of the night mingling with guests, holding her own in conversations that Victor expected her to falter in. But she didn't. Instead, she left a trail of intrigue wherever she went, her calm demeanor and sharp wit captivating even the most critical attendees. As the evening wound down, Victor joined her by the grand staircase, where she stood speaking with a pair of distinguished guests. The older of the two, a silver-haired man with a reputation for being one of the sharpest minds in finance, was laughing at something Lily had said. "You're quite the conversationalist, Mrs. Langston," the man said, tipping his glass toward her. "Your husband is lucky to have such a quick-witted partner." Lily's smile was gracious but measured. "Thank you, Mr. Carlyle. Though I suspect Victor's luck has more to do with his ability to close deals than his choice of a wife." The comment drew a chuckle from Carlyle, but Victor felt the sting of it. He stepped in smoothly, placing a hand on Lily's back as he addressed the group. "Lily has always had a talent for understatement," he said, his tone light but pointed. "It's one of the many reasons I value her." The words were meant to assert control, to remind Lily and the others that he was the one steering the ship. But Lily, as always, met him head-on. "Value is subjective, isn't it?" she said, her voice steady. "It depends entirely on perspective." The group laughed politely, sensing the subtle sparring between the couple, but choosing to interpret it as playful banter. Victor smiled, but the tightening of his jaw didn't escape Lily's notice. As the guests departed and the house fell silent, Victor found Lily in the sitting room, where she was carefully removing the diamond earrings she'd worn for the evening. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "You enjoy pushing boundaries, don't you?" he said, his voice low. Lily didn't look up. "I enjoy being honest. Not everyone in your world values that." "My world," Victor repeated, stepping closer. "It's your world too now, is it?" she asked, setting the earrings on the table. "I thought this was just an arrangement." "Your words, not mine." Victor let out a sharp breath, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You have a way of twisting everything into a challenge, Lily. You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be." "Am I?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze. "Or are you just not used to dealing with someone who doesn't fall in line?" Victor stared at her, his thoughts racing. She wasn't wrong. He wasn't used to this, not used to someone standing their ground, forcing him to question his own motives. It was unsettling, infuriating, and oddly exhilarating. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe," she replied, her tone calm. "But I've learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to play the game better than the people who think they're in charge." Her words hung in the air, a subtle challenge that Victor couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt as though he wasn't the one holding all the cards. And he hated it. As the days turned into weeks, Victor found himself increasingly preoccupied with Lily. She had become more than a puzzle to him. She was an enigma he couldn't unravel, a constant challenge to the control he had always taken for granted. It wasn't just her words that haunted him. It was the way she moved through his world as though she didn't need it, as though it didn't define her the way it defined everyone else. And then came the night of the gala. The annual Langston Foundation Gala was the pinnacle of Victor's social calendar, a glittering event attended by the city's most powerful figures. It was his chance to showcase his wealth, his influence, and now his new wife. Victor had spent weeks preparing for it, ensuring every detail was perfect. But as he stood in the grand ballroom, surrounded by the elite, it was Lily who drew every eye. She wore a dress that was simple yet stunning, its deep emerald green a perfect contrast to her dark hair. She moved through the crowd with ease, her natural poise making even the most skeptical guests take notice. Victor watched her from a distance, a glass of champagne in hand, as she engaged effortlessly with a group of prominent investors. "She's impressive," said a voice at his side. It was Charles Davenport, his longtime rival. Charles took a sip of his drink, his gaze fixed on Lily. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you to pick someone so unconventional." Victor's jaw tightened. "Lily isn't a choice. She's my wife." Charles smirked. "Of course she is. But tell me, Victor, does she know what you're really about? Does she know why you married her?" Victor turned to face him, his expression cold. "I'd be careful, Charles. You don't want to cross a line you can't step back from." Charles raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, old friend. I'm just making conversation. Though I will say, she seems far too clever to fall for your usual games." Victor didn't respond. He downed the rest of his champagne and left Charles standing by the bar. He needed air, needed to clear his head. But as he stepped out onto the balcony, he found that Lily had beaten him to it. She was leaning against the railing, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights. She didn't turn as he approached, but he knew she was aware of him. "You're avoiding the party," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I needed a moment," she replied, her tone neutral. "Your world can be overwhelming." Victor studied her profile, the way her eyes seemed to take in the city as though she belonged to it, not the other way around. "And yet you're handling it better than most." Lily let out a soft laugh, though it lacked humor. "Is that a compliment, Victor?" "It's an observation," he said. "You have a way of surprising people." She finally turned to look at him, her gaze steady. "Do I surprise you?" Victor hesitated. The truth was, she surprised him constantly. She had turned his carefully controlled life upside down, and he didn't know whether to resent her for it or admire her. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "And what did you expect?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Someone easier to manage. Someone who wouldn't challenge me at every turn." Lily smiled faintly. "I guess you underestimated me." Victor chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I don't like being underestimated, Lily, and I don't like feeling out of control." "Maybe that's your problem," she said softly. "You've spent so much of your life trying to control everything that you've forgotten how to just be." Victor frowned. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" "It means that control isn't the same as strength," she said. "Real strength comes from knowing when to let go." Her words struck a nerve, and for a moment, Victor didn't know how to respond. He had built his entire life on control, controlling his business, his image, his relationships. Letting go wasn't an option. It never had been. Before he could say anything, Lily turned back to the city, her expression thoughtful. "I think it's time we stopped pretending, Victor." Pretending, he echoed. She nodded. This marriage, this arrangement, it's all a performance. But I'm tired of playing a role. Victor's chest tightened. What are you saying? I'm saying that I know about the bet, she said, her voice calm but firm. I've known from the beginning. His blood ran cold. How? Lily turned to face him again, her gaze unflinching. Does it matter? The point is, I've always known. And I went along with it because I had my reasons. But now, I think it's time we stop pretending this is anything more than what it is. Victor felt a surge of anger, but it was mixed with something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like regret. And what do you want, Lily? Do you want out? She shook her head. No, I want honesty. If this is going to work, if we're going to keep up this charade, then we need to be honest with each other. No more games. Victor stared at her, his mind racing. She had outmaneuvered him in a way no one else ever had. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he didn't want to lose her. All right, he said at last, his voice low. No more games. Lily studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether he meant it. Then she nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Good, because I think you'll find I'm better at this game than you are. Victor let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had met his match. And though it terrified him, it also exhilarated him. The night continued, but everything felt different. The walls Victor had built around himself were beginning to crack, and he wasn't sure if he could stop them from crumbling. All he knew was that Lily had changed everything, and nothing would ever be the same again.